Good morning, everyone. Today is November 10th, 2022, and welcome to the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project started by Natalie Armstrong-Motin in the spring of 2020. Every week, we bring you a new webinar designed for mediators, arbitrators, lawyers, and anybody who negotiates. As you all know, there's no charge for these great webinars. Rather, we ask you to contribute to a food bank if you like what you see. And so far, our audiences have been so generous supporting food banks in honor of our great speakers. I'm very happy to tell you our running total since we began the series, our generous audiences have contributed, drum roll please, $330,327.35 to fight food insecurity in honor of our great speakers. And we're going to continue that record with another wonderful presentation today from Sam Ardery. Sam has mediated more than 4,000 litigated disputes throughout the country. He's taught negotiation to hundreds of lawyers who practice around the world. He's the author of Positively Conflicted, a book addressing conflicts in wide-ranging contexts. Sam speaks to lawyers and non-lawyers alike on conflict, negotiation, and mediation. He and his wife, Patty, have been married since 1983, and they live with their Boston Terrier, Ernie Pyle, in a home that backs up to a schoolyard in the Midwest. Sam, we're awfully happy to have you here to present to us on the justice gene and righteousness. And I do hope people pay attention to your book, Positively Conflicted, available on Amazon and wherever books are sold. So please tell us a little bit, Sam, about the food bank that's important to you, and then on with the presentation. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff and Sarah and Natalie. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm glad to be asked and talk a little bit about the justice gene. The Hoosier Hills Food Bank is the food bank that people will be able to link to and give to. It serves 6 counties in southern Indiana. About 25,000 people a year have their food insecurity helped by the Hoosier Hills Food Bank. So we're approaching the giving season into the holidays, and so we hope that people find a way to do some of their holiday giving to the Hoosier Hills Food Bank, because they certainly use it well. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can share my screen here. Well, that's not it. So share screen.
There we go.
Is it being shared?
Yeah.
Okay, great. There, now you got the whole page of just the screen share.
Perfect.
Great, wonderful. Well, what I'm going to talk about today is what I call the justice gene and the problem of righteousness. I find it comes into play in all sorts of different arenas. I want to tell a little bit about my story, which is what led me to become an accidental mediator. It was never my plan. In the course of that, I want to talk some about fear, some about righteousness, and some antidotes at the end that might help people deal differently with those things. So I'm going to start with, I was not a guy who loved conflict. I didn't like it in my home. I didn't like it at work. I didn't like it anywhere else. And at the first hint of conflict, my tendency was to run. I remember at one of the early mediation trainings I attended, a lot of people there said, listen, we're not fighters, we're peacemakers. And the trainer said, if you want to be a mediator, you better be comfortable in conflict, because you're in the middle of it all the time. There's no time that conflict's not going on, which was enlightening to me and not something I would have thought about on my own. So pretty much I was a guy, when conflict came, I ran. I would run physically. I ran for years by drinking. Anything I could do to avoid it is what I did. And that is kind of how I came to be the accidental mediator. So I'm going to start with a story when I was in law school. I was in my second year of law school. Law school, for anybody here that's not a lawyer, is generally 3 years. So I'm more than half, it's spring break. I'm more than halfway through. I'm an adequate, but not a star law student. And another buddy and I at spring break went to a place called the Pit Lounge, which is about what you would think it would be. It smelled like stale beer. There was one dim light over the pool table. Many of our friends had left. to go to interviews or to go to spring break. We didn't have enough money or enough interviews, so that wasn't an option for us. And we were drinking beer and talking about what we would do. So what came to my mind after several beers and several rounds of pool was maybe we should drive to Florida and watch the space shuttle take off, and then we should drive to Edwards Air Force Base in Southern California and watch it land. And my friend Ron pointed out we didn't have much money, and we thought, well, if we pooled our resources, we might have enough for peanut butter and gasoline. So we finished at the pit lounge, probably in the early morning sometime, went home, went to bed. When he woke up the next morning, he thought that is a really horrible idea. I woke up the next morning, wrote the dean a note, and quit law school. I didn't withdraw from any of my classes. I didn't give anybody any notice. I just left the dean a note, said, I hate this, I'm gone. I bought a bus ticket. There was a 2-week bus ticket to go west. I worked with a rural mailman in Tucson for a while. Then I went to San Francisco, and then I ended up working as a bar back in Harvey's Casino in South Lake Tahoe. For those of you that don't know what a bar back is, it's kind of a job where you work in the bowels of the casino, cutting up lemons and limes, preparing things for the real bartenders. Once you've done it for a while, you graduate to the bar itself, but not as a bartender. The bar back is a person that actually holds various guns. One gun has drinks and alcohol in it. The other gun has mixers, and you mix them for the cocktail servers. At the time, they were all cocktail waitresses, but the cocktail servers, and they call them out, and you mix 20 drinks and they take them out. Well, I was not any better at being a bar back than I was a law student. So I stayed there for a little while, and I lived in the back room with a guy who was a failed professional baseball player and a former mechanic. And while I was there, I got a note from the dean of the law school, a guy named Len Fromm, who was a legendary dean at the Indiana University Maurer School of Law. And Dean Fromm said, Sam, I wish we'd had a chance to talk. I've withdrawn you from all of your classes so you didn't fail everything. And I'm going to give you a 1-year blanket leave of absence to return to law school anytime in the next year without having to reapply. And he finished the note. At the bottom of the note, he hand wrote, the unexamined life is not worth living. And he gave me the blanket 1-year leave of absence. Now, what I want to say is I did nothing to earn that. I did, as you heard, I was irresponsible enough to just quit law school. What I qualified for is to fail all my classes. Only the dean saved me from that and gave me a 1-year blanket leave to return, which I ultimately did. And interestingly, too, the manager of the casino, I told him I might want a job longer than the summer when I was there. And he said, at the end of the summer, I'm going to fire you because you need to go finish law school. So 2 people that owed me nothing, both were kind to me in letting me come back. And that's ultimately what I did. This is a little bit the way I think about mediation. It's in negotiation generally. There's a state of order where people are fine with things. And then there's disorder. And then people are looking for reorder. Now, if it's a negotiation, it's because they're worried about keeping something they have that they're negotiating for, or to get something that they don't have that they want to get. And that creates some kind of a disorder or some kind of a conflict or relationship they're going to need to have to see if they can get that. And then they get to reorder. But I think about that when I think of people that come to my office, whether Zoom or live these days, to do mediations. Something has happened in their lives that they did not expect to happen. Most people do not wake up in the morning hoping to need a lawyer, because most of us think we have the right amount of common sense. Surely if I say it one way or another way, or if I'm patient enough, these other folks are going to come around. So there's disorder when they find out that things aren't working out the way they wished. And then we have a moment of reorder, perhaps, when a mediation gets settled, a negotiation ends, or people choose to stop arguing in other contexts. But when I look at conflict, negotiation, mediation, here's what I find to be the most common way that most of us respond to conflict. Why don't you change so I'll feel better? And if you think about your own conflicts, whether it's with a partner, someone at work, someone who cuts in line at the deli, aren't you thinking, why don't you change so I'll feel better? Why don't you change because I'm a reasonable person? And if you just came around to my way of thinking, we wouldn't have to have this conflict at all. And I would guess, and that's why I talk about the problem of righteousness or the problem of principle that we'll talk about later, is everybody comes in with that. Otherwise, there's no dispute. Mediators don't have jobs. There's nothing to negotiate. If one side says, I want this, and the other side surrenders and gives it to them, there simply is no conflict. What I find is many people in my office want pain-free conflict, and I call that option F, which is fantasy. There is no pain-free conflict. There is at least some level of discomfort. And I'm yet to meet the person who wants discomfort. We may choose it. If you talk to someone who's an athlete, they are willing to go through some degree of discomfort to perform better athletically. People that want to be good students may choose to study instead of go to the bars like I did before I quit law school. But the idea that it will be pain-free or completely without discomfort, I simply find is a fantasy goal. So in 1994, and I'm jumping ahead now, I was admitted to the bar in 1984, and I was working as a trial lawyer. Tried lots of cases. I've tried dozens of cases to jury, but in that same period of time, I also started drinking really, really heavily. So by 1994, I'm drinking about a quart of vodka a day. Still trying cases, going to my office. At that point, I'm married, got 3 kids, 3 daughters. But what I was basically was a drunk litigator. And I went to mediation training not to really learn about mediation. The truth is I didn't know anything about it at all. I went to mediation training because I was a litigator and I was arrogant enough to think, I just want to find out what these people are going to do to me so I can counteract it in some way. I would love to tell you there was some selfless or worthy goal, but there wasn't. And that's what I did. So I call it being an unintended mediator because I went to mediation training in 1994. And in 1995, in January, I did my first mediation. And I call that the slow path forward because I did one in 1995, and now I've done more than 4,000 mediations over time. And the reason I'm talking about this story, and each of you has your own story of how you got into mediation or how you negotiate or how you negotiate, mediate, or deal with conflict in your lives. But this is my story, and I learned lots of things when I stopped drinking by thinking differently than I'd thought before. And it helped me relate to people that come into my office thinking very differently than I used to think. So the way I like to think about this is mediator, know thyself. I remember going to a training years ago, and somebody said, it was a negotiation training, and somebody said that the trainer said, the people that negotiate the best are not a particular personality type. They're the people that know themselves the best. Now, he was careful to say there weren't people that necessarily acted like themselves all the time, because if we know ourselves well, we know we have some weaknesses and we don't want to put them on display all the time. But the people that know themselves the best tend to be the best negotiators. And I found the same is true of mediators. The reason I have traits and emotions traveling together up there is I sometimes hear people talk who are mediators, professional negotiators, judges, and we will talk almost as if we are above the fray, that we're almost inhuman, that it's for us, it's a transaction while it's a relationship for other people, perhaps, but we have an ability to set those emotions aside. And at least what I've found, and you'll hear some failure stories from me in a little bit, but what I've found as a mediator is that I can't set those emotions aside, nor can I say which ones are going to prevail any given moment. I can choose if I'm aware how I want to respond, but joy and sadness exist together. I think it was Henry Nouwen who said, joy and sadness kiss one another at each moment. Anxiety, justice, entitlement, revenge, acceptance, fear, contempt, all of these are swimming in the same pool. And for those of you that mediate, you've run into, I'm sure, people that have all of them swimming in the same pool, but there's something about that focus that we bring people and their lawyers into our offices or into our Zoom rooms. And as they focus on whatever that conflict is or whatever that lawsuit might be, it becomes so much more important. And I'm not saying that it's not important, but that focus makes it even more important than it would otherwise be. So we're dealing with people who have very difficult problems going on. They've set aside everything else to focus on that problem, and getting through it becomes very difficult. And I'm going to talk some about fear in a few minutes, but I want to go back to me quitting law school in terms of how fear plays out, at least in my mind. So when I was leaving law school back in 1982, I guess it would have been, and I just quit and ran away, I would have told you or anyone that asked that the reason I left was because I had a broader sense of what the world ought to be, and law schools were very limiting, and I thought better than the people that were there. Now, all of that was baloney. They were all excuses, but that's probably what I would have said. There is no time that I would have told you that fear was part of it. Most of my friends that were in law school were at the top of the class. I wasn't in the top of the class. But what I would have told you is, had I studied as hard as them, had I gone to class like they did, had I done the work they did, then I would have been top of the class too. Again, that's another fantasy. I was making that up. We will never know if that's the case. But after I stopped drinking, someone told me this story, and for the first time, I had some understanding of why I left law school, and it gave me some insight into running from conflict. And here's the story. There was a guy that was a great saxophone player, and he lived in South Bend, Indiana. And anytime the big bands would come through and play in Chicago, they'd go call this guy to come play with them. Say, please come play with us. We've got this gig going on in downtown Chicago. We'll pay you well. Come join us. And he would. Well, then one of these bands had a gig in New Orleans. And the gig in New Orleans was going to be for an extended period of time. And they had a bus fare, plane fare for him to get to New Orleans. And they had a place for him to live. And they said, come to New Orleans. This will be the best job you've ever had. You'll make more money. We got a place for you to stay. Come join us. And he kept saying no, and he kept saying no, and he kept saying no. And so they sent one of their friends from Chicago over to South Bend. It's about an hour away, to see him and say, why won't you come? And here was his answer. As long as I stay in South Bend, Indiana, I can think I'm the best saxophone player in the world. If I go to New Orleans, I have to find out. He was afraid to find out. And I would say that was that same thing was true of me in law school. It was easier for me to not give it my best effort, to go ahead and drink, to not go to class, ultimately to quit because I was a mediocre law student. I didn't want to be a mediocre law student. That was a much more dramatic way to finish it out. It was easier for me to do that than do the hard work of showing up, of doing the studying, of living with the discomfort of studying instead of going to the party or whatever else I might want to do. And that helped me so much in seeing the fear of that. And sometimes the fear we see in lawyers that are doing litigation and how they negotiate things. But those fears are important. And I find they're particularly important with people we're dealing with who are coming to the mediations who may not be lawyers. And I remember going to a mediation one day, and one of my partners, who's now a judge, we were going out to meet the clients, and she said, do you know how nervous these people are? And I was so self-consumed, it didn't even occur to me how nervous they were. She said, you're doing this every day, but they're not. And so it helps me to think about these fears when I talk with other people and when I think about myself. And here, what I think of generally where the four fears come from: fear of security and survival, fear of esteem and affection, fear of power and control, and fear of comfort and ease. And when I say fear of losing any of those things, we're afraid of losing security, esteem, power, and comfort. And when I see how people respond and I see people get angry, I would not say 100% of the time, but a lot of the time, the anger comes from some kind of fear. And if they're angry about things that don't resonate with me, my immediate tendency is to be impatient with them or get angry back, or to be arrogant enough to tell them they need to get over that so we can get on with the job at hand, which is my agenda to settle this case. But if I can be aware of this fear that they all have, then I can think very differently about how I approach them, and I can be a little bit more patient about what we're doing from that point forward. So fear plays a bigger role. I find most people don't want to talk about their fears, nor do I, but I find it's really important. And I find that the external conflicts are often driven by the internal conflicts, and we all have them. Go with me for a minute here. I think, generally speaking, that almost everything can be put into the category of one of these five things. Everything in life. And we could parse that out and argue about it, but stay with me here for a minute. Recreation, belief system, family and social, health and wellness, and work and education. The one people ask the most questions about is belief system. And for some people, it's a religious creed. For some people, it could be yoga. For other people, it could be a moral code. Whatever that umbrella is under which you might choose to live your life. That's what I mean by belief system. And I've asked this question, or asked people to do this exercise all over the place. And I'm going to ask you to do it now. We won't take time to completely sort our way through it, but I'm still going to ask you to do it. So if you write these down vertically, recreation, belief system, family, social, health and wellness, work and education. If you write those down on the page, and then on the left, 1 through 5, let's assume they all have value. 1 through 5, list them in the way that you think they have the most value, which is the most important, which is the least important, but even the least important still has value. And after you've done that, and we're not going to take the time to do it here, you can take the time to do it, but I'm going to, what I'm going to say now will interfere with what the exercise would otherwise be. On the right side, I would like you to consider if someone followed you around with a video camera for the last 3 days, what would the objective evidence that shows in the video camera reflect about your priorities? Do the 5 numbers on the left match the 5 sides on the right? I've done this with way over 1,000 people, and I find there are at most a handful that will tell me that all 5 match. Some of them match, but rarely do all 5 match. Now, when I first did this with a sociologist friend of mine many years ago, he said, well, if the left side doesn't match the right, there are only 2 ways to resolve internal conflicts. One is on the left side to be honest with yourself and change your priorities. Or 2 is on the right side, if your priorities are what you really believe them to be, change your behavior to match them. And that sounds fine. And it makes some logical sense from a real reductionistic standpoint. But if almost everybody finds they don't match, unless we catch them just at the right time, then I would say there's another option. And that's to integrate our reality. And our reality is we are routinely conflicted internally about things. I think about it when the alarm goes off and somebody doesn't like getting up early in the morning, there's a conflict right there. Do they hit the snooze button and sleep late and miss the meeting they're supposed to be to? Even though the sleep feels good, but does it feel as good, or does it feel good enough to miss the meeting and have the embarrassment of not showing up? For me, I'd always like to lose 10 pounds. So if I go home and there's cake on the counter at the end of the night, 9 times out of 10, I'm eating the cake. Now, that doesn't mean I don't want the cake and I don't want to lose 10 pounds, but when I'm confronted with that immediate reality of the cake being there that I want that gets in the way of my other goal, I've got a conflict. And so we're resolving those conflicts all the time. And I think they take some toll on us, as they do with the people that come to see us as mediators and also with lawyers. And as they take that toll, they take away our energy to deal with other conflicts that are in front of us. So I find at the very least being aware of them and sometimes giving ourselves a break. And if it's true for me, and I struggle with those, then maybe it lets me be a little bit kinder to other people. And sometimes I'm not even aware of it. So I would encourage people to pay more attention to the physical symptoms, yours and theirs. Usually if there's conflict, there's some kind of physical response, whether it's a knot in your stomach, your throat tightens up, your face may flush, your palms get sweaty, all those things happen. So what I want to do anytime I feel that physical symptom, it's a time for me to be very well aware that something's going on. There's some kind of conflict going on. Is it in me? Is it in them? Is it in both of us? Because then I'm making a better choice. I want to talk a little bit about how our brains work with conflict, because I think it's really, really important that we recognize this. Years ago, when Bush and Kerry, I'm not doing this because it's election season, but when Bush and Kerry were running for president, there was a researcher named Drew Weston at Emory University. And he put people into an fMRI machine to see how their brains were working in real time. And he presented the Bush supporters with something that Bush said that was inconsistent with what they believed about Bush. And he presented Kerry supporters with a statement that Kerry had made that was inconsistent with what they believed about Kerry. And here's what happened. The parts of the brain that deal with extreme pain lit up when people were confronted with an inconsistent statement, something different than what they already believed. It's true whether it was the Kerry supporter or the Bush supporter. So it was not partisan. It happened in everybody's brains. The next thing that happened, with no further stimulus of any kind, is that the activity in the brain migrated toward the pleasure parts of the brain, the same part of the brain that is lit up when a heroin addict gets a fix, and they felt better with nothing else. They put aside the conflict, they ran away from the conflict, and their brains felt better. They actually experienced some pleasure. So if we go back to that, in the nature of things, order, disorder, reorder, the brain does it on its own. There's a reason most people, if you ask people to raise their hands in a room and say, how many of you like conflict? It'll be the rare hand is my guess that goes up. When I ask even negotiation students or people I'm doing seminars with on negotiation, how many people like negotiation, hardly anybody's hand goes up. They would like to do it better, but they don't like it. That disorder, even if denial gets them back to order, they will choose it. And so here are three things that I find are choices we can make, and they're part of what I talk about in my book when we feel that conflict. So when you experience that physicality of it, here are three things we can do. One, we can say, okay, I'm uncomfortable. I feel this pain physically, emotionally, psychologically. I'm going to embrace it. Embracing it doesn't mean I like it. It just means I'm not going to run from it. I may just choose to sit with it for a little while. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to listen radically. And when I talk about radical listening, I'm not talking about the kind of listening that we learned about in Psychology 101 of active listening and nodding and repeating it back. The radical way I'm talking about listening is listening in a way that I'm open to the possibility that I could be wrong. Whether it's 1% or 50%, I want to listen, not preparing my response, not thinking about what's wrong with what the other person is saying, not thinking about the facts that are inconsistent, but listening radically so I can make an honest effort to understand, whether I ever do or not, to understand where they're coming from. And even if I never understand, I can choose to accept it. I don't have to pick the fight. And the last one is accepting responsibility, owning my part in any conflict. Without my thinking, without me being in it, there is no conflict. If I just give up and say you can have what you want, there is no conflict. So even if I think I'm not responsible for starting it, or the other side is being unreasonable, the only way the conflict exists is if I continue to participate in it. And it comes into play when I talk about righteousness or principle when people are in a mediation. And I'm going to give you one relatively short example. I've got several involving my wife, but she gave me permission to tell these. This was a time I'd stopped drinking. It's probably 1995, 1996. And a friend calls. My wife and I have been married now for 39 years, but we were going through a really, really rocky patch. And so a friend calls, said, Sam, let me buy you a sandwich. So we go out to dinner at a local deli, and we sit there, and my friend says, how you doing? And I proceeded, I'm glad I don't have a transcript of this, but for some lengthy period of time, I proceeded to tell my friend everything that was wrong with Patty. From stem to stern, I told him everything that was wrong with Patty. And finally, he let me talk myself out. And then he said, are you done? I said, yeah, I guess so. And I noticed he wasn't saying anything or nodding his head. And then he said this. He said, Sam, for purposes of our conversation, I'm going to assume, or I'm willing to assume, that Patty is 95% of the problem. From this point forward, we're only going to talk about your 5%. And he owned me. I mean, how could I not say I wasn't 5% responsible for whatever problems or conflicts that were going on in our marriage? There's no way I could say that. And sometimes I want to keep that in mind, because when somebody asks me what went wrong, my first instinct is to point to other people, whether it's in a mediation or an argument with my wife or a disagreement with my partners or somebody driving on the highway. My response is what's wrong with them. If they would just, back to the slide earlier, why don't you change so I'll feel better? But if I can keep track of that 5%, or what in my case might have been my 95%, it gives me a chance to engage in a different way. I think about it differently. I engage with the people differently. They feel differently about it. So this is what I call the justice gene. And the justice gene it's sitting there all the time deep in our bellies. I've got friends who are biologists, and they haven't told me that they've discovered the justice gene, but I believe it exists. You know it when it gets stung. It's the instinctive certainty that things are not as they should be. Anytime you find yourself saying, that's not fair, your justice gene has been stung. You've got an internal belief about what's fair, what's just, and the way things ought to happen. And what we know from the work we do as mediators or lawyers or just living our lives is that we all have it. We know when it gets stung, because if it affects us and somebody makes what we think is an unfair argument, we have those physical symptoms. So the justice gene gets stung, and until it gets stung, somebody's there to disagree with us. We don't even know it. Here's an added element of that. When people feel justness, that justice is not happening, or that fairness is not happening, and they add a moral overlay to that, it can be religious, it can be societal, it can be just they know in their guts it's not right, it makes the problems even worse. There's a woman named Linda Stitka at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and she's done research on this. And here are two things she finds that I think are important for us to remember as mediators, as lawyers, and as people. if people attach they don't just have that fundamental feeling of injustice, but they also think there's a moral imperative there, then there's an increased unwillingness to compromise, and people become tolerant of any means to achieving the goal, including lying and violence. Now, I'm hoping you're not drawn to lying and violence, but if you pay attention to your justice gene the next time it gets tweaked, see if somewhere in the recesses of your mind you're not inclined to thinking some of those thoughts. If you wouldn't like somebody to get slapped down, or you wouldn't like to tell them something that's not the truth, to try to manipulate them into doing something you'd like them to do. This is an example of my own justice gene being tweaked, and it happened years ago when our daughter was playing AAU basketball. And for some of you that don't know, AAU basketball is a more competitive league of basketball, usually for people that are better athletes. That is not a description of any of our daughters. They were all perfectly average athletes, but we had a friend who wanted to have an AAU team for some of the girls that probably weren't going to be able to make the primary AAU team. His name was Jack. So our daughter Grace is asked to be on this team, and she wants to do it. It involves getting up early on Sunday mornings and traveling all over the place to play these games. And we go to this game in a large gym. The gym's seated about 7,500 people. And the only people that are in it were the two teams and some parents, scattered parents around, probably 10 or 15 parents. Our team was horrible. We had some games where we scored no points at all. Some games we'd score 2 or 4 points. So we go to this game, the first half ends, and we've scored 4 points. The other team has 22 or 24 points. And at the beginning of the second half, they press us. So they're playing really aggressive defense. First time they steal the ball, score again, 2 more points. Second time they steal the ball again, 2 more points. Next time we couldn't even get the ball in, and the referee handed the ball to the other side. So we'd given up our possession completely. And I'm watching this, I'm looking around and I'm thinking, my justice gene is tweaked deeply. So I've got my daughter playing. What's going on in the arena seems not okay. It's clear the other team's better. These are 12-year-old girls. What in the heck's going on? And nobody's doing anything about it. So I decided that I needed to be the individual arbiter of justice that day in this 7,500 seat gym that had 15 people in it. So I stood up and I yelled at the other coach. And I said, what are you doing? Don't you see what's going on? We know you're better than us. Why would you be trying to humiliate these girls? Like, this is 12-year-old basketball. And I noticed that everybody was looking at me. The gym was completely silent and everyone could hear me. My friend who was sitting next to me moved away. He didn't want to be anywhere near me. And the coach, Jack, looked at me and said, Sam, I asked them to press so we could practice on it. The only perspective that made sense to me was mine. And if something was going on here was unjust, it was negatively affecting my daughter and the other daughters on the team, and somebody needed to do something about it. If nobody else was going to, then I was. And I like to remember that, as embarrassing as it is. You may have had those moments also where you're just embarrassed to be you. This is when even thinking about it, my heart rate goes up a little bit. But I want to remember we trust deeply in our own instincts and our perspectives, and we are routinely wrong. And that's where the justice gene comes in to betray us sometimes. We don't necessarily know because the other people feel just as strongly about their own righteousness. Looks like I've got enough time, so I'll tell this story as well. This is specifically a mediation story. I'm doing a mediation. The young woman who was the plaintiff in this case was a minor when the event happened that the lawsuit surrounded, but she was of majority age. She was over 18 when we were mediating the case. But she still brought her lawyers and she brought her parents with her to this mediation. We were going through the morning and into the afternoon. And after a while, I noticed that we weren't getting very far and nobody was really letting her talk. She was saying nothing. So finally in the late afternoon, I said her name and I said, we don't seem to be getting anywhere. I've heard a lot. I've heard your parents talk. I've heard your lawyers talk, but I haven't really heard you say anything. Would you be willing to tell me kind of what you're thinking about this and how you would like things to go from this point forward? And before she could say anything, her lawyer pounds his hand on the table, leans forward and points at me, said, don't you ever talk to my client without asking my permission. I don't care what she thinks. Almost before he was done, I did the same thing. I smacked my hand on the table and pointed at him and I said, don't you ever come into my office and tell me that you don't care what your client thinks. Somewhere in the midst of finishing that sentence, I realized this would not be in the how-to video of how to be a good mediator. And I stopped and I said, I'm really sorry. There's no reason for me to respond like that. I'm going to go back to my office now. And you all can decide whether you want me to continue to participate in this process or not, but I'm really sorry. I went back to my office. I sat there, I would guess, for about a half hour, just which seemed like days. And then the other lawyer was a woman who's a great trial lawyer, who I've known for a long time. And she comes into my office and she walks around the table and she kind of pats me on the shoulder and she said, "Sam, I knew we had an anger management problem in the other room. I just didn't know it was you." And she was right. She was right. There are many things I could have done that would have helped, but I didn't stop to ask anybody's help. I didn't catch myself when I felt those physical symptoms coming. I just believed in my own common sense. I'm not going to talk about this much, but there's a woman named Francesca Gino, who's a professor at Harvard, who wrote a book about choices and how we are disinclined. It's called Sidetracked, how we're disinclined to take the advice of others. And she studied things from game shows to how Walmart went into Germany to open stores, and how we are disinclined to take the advice of others, when more often than not, we would be better off taking that advice. So when I have that response to the justice gene, it's a great time, if it's available to me, to ask somebody else. Some of you are probably familiar with Daniel Kahneman. He won the Nobel Prize, I think, in 2002. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. He's a psychologist and an economist. And this is a story he tells. I don't think it's in his book, but he tells the story. He and his wife go to a cocktail party. And at the cocktail party, his wife kind of pulls at his sleeve and whispers in his ear, "See that man across the room?" And he says, "Yeah." He said, "He's so sexy, he undresses the maid himself." And Kahneman shakes his head thinking, what is she talking about? But then she moves away and they stay at the cocktail party another couple of hours. And Kahneman can't really concentrate on anything else because he's thinking about this totally nonsensical thing that his wife said. So they go home, and they get home. He's still thinking about it. They get in the door and he said, "Honey, I just got to ask you, what were you talking about when you said that man was so sexy, he undresses the maid himself?" And she kind of looked down and shook her head and she said, "That is not what I said. I said he's so sexy, he doesn't underestimate himself." The important part of that story for me is that Daniel Kahneman, who is one of the smartest people on earth, who's won the Nobel Prize, when his wife said something that didn't make sense to him, it never occurred to him that he might have misunderstood. The only thought running through his head for those 2 hours was that his wife said something that didn't make sense. And we all think we have just the right amount of common sense. So when we encounter other people who feel differently, think differently, argue differently, live differently, they are doing exactly what makes sense to them. It may not make sense to us. And if we can embrace discomfort, and if we can radically listen, and if we can accept our responsibility, we can find a way to engage with them rather than just write them off. People come to us after they've gone through the litigation process, spend a lot of money for an unknown outcome that happens in an indeterminate amount of time, all investing in their righteousness and their own common sense. So what I want to talk about now for just a minute is what I think, it's an acronym that I think gives us an antidote to that instinctive feeling response we have to the justice gene. And it's this. It's PARC, P-A-R-C. And what I want to do is be really aware of the physical symptoms that show me that a conflict is brewing, even if they're minor. And I want to do these 4 things. I want to pause, literally take a breath. Pausing and taking a breath changes things physiologically, intellectually, and psychologically. So I want to take a breath and step back. Now, in that moment, if it's extreme conflict, my body will respond as if a tiger is chasing me and ready to kill me. Now, some people may have circumstances where that's really happening, but it's extraordinarily rare. So I would say almost any time you have that feeling, unless you have to physically run, you can afford to take the breath. Most of us, whether it's worry or anger or responding, there's something about that response that lets us think we have control. I would argue that's somewhere between an illusion and a delusion, but we'll think it. So pause, take the breath. The next is assess. And I say perception of the facts here. Perception is really important, just like at that basketball game. I only had one perception of the facts. It did not occur to me something else could be going on. So I want to pause. I want to take the breath, say, this is my perception of the facts. And then I can say, okay, might there be another? I may think no, but it's a good time for me to ask the question. And that's the reflection part. What's the context? What are the consequences of me running off with whatever my interpretation is? What are the personalities? What are the options beyond me just investing more in me? And I want to choose. I want to balance the trade-offs between my perception, other people's perception, their common sense, my common sense, and I want to be broader than just reach a conclusion. Now I'm going to show you an example, and when I did this example at another talk about a week ago, someone didn't like the example because they thought I was unfair to one of the people, and I'm willing to hear that criticism, but I'm going to use the example anyway, and I'll tell you why. Here's the example. I teach a class at the law school. I teach negotiation to students there. And we talked about the concept of PARC just before the Academy Awards this year. And for those of you that saw or read about it afterwards on social media, at the Academy Awards, Will Smith got upset with Chris Rock, who was the host, and ran up on stage and slapped Chris Rock across the face. There was lots of speculation of why he might have done that, whether because Chris Rock was insulting his wife or other reasons. But these are the facts in terms of what happened. But I came into the class the next week, and one of my students said, Will Smith needed to learn to PARC, which seemed to make sense. And then somebody else pointed out, well, Chris Rock showed a great example of PARC. In the midst of something he totally did not accept, he's slapped on the face in front of 1 billion people who are watching this, and he found some way to find some level of equanimity, at least outwardly. He at least paused and took the breath. Whether he went through all 4 stages of PARC, we don't know. Chris Rock probably isn't going to call me and tell me. Neither is Will Smith. But afterwards, when I gave this presentation, somebody came up and said, you know, I think you were really unfair to Will Smith. I've read his biography, and he had a lot of things going on in his childhood that led him to do that. And I've not read his biography. But for me, that's just the point. You've heard my bad examples. You heard my example at the basketball game and the mediation. I'm not claiming to be any better than Chris Rock. I reacted immediately without parking at all. But I think the point is, whether it's Chris Rock or whether it's me in a mediation or me at a girls' basketball game, when I feel that surge, it's a great time to do the opposite of what I'm inclined to do. And the opposite of what I'm inclined to do is to pause and not do anything. My inclination is to do something, even if it's not going to help. So the problem of righteousness, and we're going to run out of time, but I want to talk about it a little bit. This is another Patty example. This has been probably 15 years ago, and we were arguing about something. We're standing in the living room. I remember the time of year because there were leaves falling off the trees. I do not remember what we were arguing about. I say we, it was basically me pontificating, I think. So we're standing in the living room, and I'm going on, and I'm pretty energized about whatever this point is that I want to make. And I noticed Patty is saying nothing at all. And finally I stopped. And she looked at me and she put her hand on her hip and she said, Sam, would you rather be right or would you rather be married? Now that raised the stakes a lot. She left the room before I could answer. I mean, the right answer is I'd rather be married, and we are still married. But whatever I was doing had become so important to me that paying attention to the relationship, paying attention to the broader concept, paying attention to the fact that she wasn't saying anything in her body language, the most important thing to me in that moment was being right. And if you told me to go through the 5 things, go back to, is my relationship more important than being right? Is our marriage more important than being right? I would tell you intellectually that's true, but there was nothing about my behavior that was consistent with that. So it's another time to pay attention to those physical symptoms. They are warnings that it's time for us to pause. So here's something I try to keep in mind a lot. Being right is really expensive and way overrated. We're inclined to it. We like it. It makes me feel better. It feeds my ego. And even if you think I'm wrong, I will feed my ego all on my own, thinking I'm right. But those moments when you feel most righteous are the best times for you to pause. So in mediations, we often run into people saying it's not about the money, it's about the principle. And for those of you that mediate, or you may have said this yourself, or other people may have said it to you. And so what I'd like you to think about for a second, and even after this podcast, is how you respond when somebody says it's not about the money, it's about the principle. And I will tell you my most common response before I had this much white hair was baloney. It's always about the money. It has nothing to do with the principle. But over time, I've really come to believe that it is about the principle. It's just that we're in the context of doing something that we feel like our principles are violated and someone needs to stand up for them. We think there's some outside arbiter that's going to stand up for our principles. So here's the conversation I've come to have with people. When somebody tells me it's not about the money, it's about the principle, here's the conversation we have. I'll say, well, this is almost always the case. Your own lawyer will admit that there's a 1% chance of losing this case. Maybe it's a 20 or 50% chance. There's a 1% chance of losing this case. I know you don't think it ought to happen. You don't think it will happen, but it's at least out there. So let me ask you this question. If that 1% happens, and if the judge or jury get it wrong, are your principles going to change? Are your principles going to change? I've asked that to hundreds, if not thousands of people. No one has ever told me yes. No one has ever said, you bet if the jury gets it wrong, then I'm changing my principles. If the judge rules against me, I'm changing my principles. They don't, because their principles are too important. None of us are going to hand our principles over to some third party to decide them. We'll say the judge got it wrong, the jury got it wrong, justice wasn't done, but we are not going to say our principles are going to change. And once we've gone through that, I'll say, well, let's talk about the other room for a minute. If the jury goes your way, or the judge goes your way, as you think they should and as you think they will, do you think their principles are going to change? Now, often their first comment is, no, their principles aren't going to change because they don't have any principles. So we move beyond that. And then they usually acknowledge, no, their principles aren't going to change. If my principles aren't going to change, and my principles are really supreme, if the jury or judge gets it wrong, then certainly theirs aren't either. What I find that helps with is it helps us carry on the conversation. And I'll tell people, I do not have the right or ability to challenge your principles. I don't have the standing to do that. It'd be inappropriate. They're too important to you. So I need to accept your principles. They may be different from other people's, but what we're doing in this context is not talking about your principles because they are uniquely yours. And then we can talk about litigation or other things that are going on. But saying I'm going to let the jury decide it because they're going to decide my principles, I'd say is a dangerous place to go. Here are 3 questions after that I find really helpful. This is a picture of Atul Gawande, who wrote the book Being Mortal. If you haven't read it, it's worth the read. He talks about a lot of things with the development of the extended care system in the United States for older people, nursing homes and things like that. But he also talks about, as we deal with aging parents, how we deal with it. And a friend gave my wife and me this book as we had aging parents. And here are 3 questions. He doesn't ask them exactly this way, but very importantly, and I find they're really important when I'm talking to people in a mediation. What do you want? And often you'll hear people be much more able to quickly tell you what they don't want than what they do. But that's a question. What do you want? And then what are your biggest concerns and fears? Again, people will tend to talk about their concerns more than their fears. But if we talk about that, it gets us to the third question, which is, what trade-offs are you willing to make? And whether we're talking about money or behavior in a litigated setting, it allows people to say, well, I'm afraid of this. There are risks. I'm not guaranteed of an outcome. Is accepting this or paying that worth it because I avoid the fears? I've eliminated the fears then. I've identified the trade-offs. I've made a rational decision, or the best decision for me based on my values and my priorities. And it changes the context of the conversation. I find if I ask myself these questions, it's really, really helpful. I've got a friend who teaches psychology, and his expertise is gratitude. But he also talks a lot about decision making, and he talks about making T-charts. He said, we've often made T-charts of pros and cons. He said, that usually is insufficient. We can kind of skew it either way, and it doesn't give us the kind of certainty we'd like. And there may not be absolute certainty anyway. But he said, if people do that, and then after they've made their T-chart, they close their eyes and they sit back and lean back in a chair and start trying to visualize how they feel about the decision they make either way, it tends to give them a better idea of whatever they think is the best decision for them. So mediator, know thyself, I find is essential. We have principles and emotions too. You will know when they get ticked off. I'll find sometimes late in the mediation when somebody brings up old stuff or brings a new person in that hasn't been involved, they decide to call them on the phone and they don't know anything about what we've been doing the last 6 or 8 hours. I'll find myself having that response. My justice gene's being tweaked. I'm saying, listen, I've set the agenda here. I'm the mediator. I'm the guy you hired. What are you doing bringing these other people in that I got to explain it to? I mean, I've made that mediation about me. I'm entitled in my mind to be treated a certain way. And that doesn't help at all for me to be entitled to be treated a certain way. Other people get to do whatever they want, and I get to decide how to respond. One of my best examples of that is I went into a mediation and there was an experienced insurance adjuster on one side and a plaintiff's lawyer on the other side. And we went in and the plaintiff had demanded $100,000. The insurance adjuster had offered 20. And I go into the mediation and talk to them all. And the plaintiff's lawyer reduces her demand to 90. Said, I want to settle this case. Let's find out. I go into the defense room, and the insurance adjuster reduces his number. He doesn't get closer to her. He goes backwards. Instead of 20, offers 10. And I said, can you help me a little bit with that? It'll probably end the mediation. The other lawyer will probably walk out. Can you give me some reasons that I can take to them on why you've lowered your number? Have the facts changed, perspective changed? Help me with that a little bit. And the adjuster leaned over and looked me in the eye and said, Sam, just what part of $10,000 don't you understand? I was immediately insulted. He wasn't following my rules. He wasn't following the rules conventionally that most people. So I literally could feel my face flush. That was a time I needed to leave the room and get a drink of water and go back in. And I said, listen, it's your money. You get to do with this whatever you want. It is your case. But I do want to give you a fair warning. I know the other lawyer. I would expect her to leave. She won't stay. She got closer to you and you moved further away. I would expect her to quit and take her client and leave. And he said, just take her the offer. And I did. And she left. And then I came back and the guy was mad at me that she left. But there may have been a more skillful way for me to do that. But it was another good reminder to me when I have that physical response, there's something I think that I'm entitled to. So as I finish, and I'm not going to tell a bunch of other stories because we've only got about 10 minutes left, but I would encourage you to think about PARC. Pause, assess, reflect, and choose. And in the moment when you feel that righteousness, that physicality of being right and your justice gene's been stung, my guess is, if you're like me, your responsibility to say, beans to PARC, I'm mad. I'm going to tell them exactly what I think. And sometimes you might, and sometimes you might PARC. Also, there are moments where it happens really quickly. If we talk about the Academy Awards or somebody's immediately insulted you, if you just pause, you're way ahead of the game. You are far ahead of what most people do. If in that moment of physicality and having your justice gene stung, it could be by a client, a lawyer, a friend, a spouse, a partner. If you just pause and take the breath, you have changed the dynamic. You haven't come right back at somebody. You haven't gone nose to nose in the fight. You've got different things happening physically in you, and you have at least given yourself and that other person an opportunity to do things differently than just your instincts. If you do the rest, great. These are the three I talk about in the book. I talk about them more extensively. I'd invite you to take a look at them and decide whether you think they apply or not, whether you think I'm full of beans, and I'm happy to hear it if people want to send me emails after the fact. The final thing I want to tell you is this, because I find it incredibly helpful, and it's a good reminder to me when I'm experiencing those moments of conflict and my justice gene's been stung. And it's a quote from an Immortal's book, Rules of Civility. He wrote a better known one called A Gentleman in Moscow, and he's got a new one out, I think, called the Lincoln Highway, I believe. Anyway, this is the quote. I have found so many times, in times of high emotion, when I'm inclined to just say something back, to put up my armor and protect myself, the next thing I say usually makes me feel better, and it rarely helps the situation. And this kind of is his more literary way of going to PARC. It's the pause piece. That's it. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Jeff and Sarah and Natalie for inviting me to do this. I want to thank all of you that came and spent, you could have been doing anything else for the last 50 minutes and you chose to spend them here. And I want to tell you I'm honored and I appreciate it. Here's my email. You're welcome to send me an email. Here's the book. The last thing I want to say is, again, we've talked about it being the season for giving. The Hoosier Hills Food Bank does enormous good for people who don't have enough to eat. The most fundamental thing in life, they don't have enough of it. And so if you find it in your heart and your willingness to donate, whether it's to the Hoosier Hills Food Bank or a food bank close to you to help people that are food insecure, I would strongly encourage you to do that. So thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Natalie. And I've got nothing else to present.
Sam, thank you. That was a terrific presentation. We're getting a lot of positive comments in the chat. No surprise. It was really a fine presentation. We thank you. There's one question here. Roger Moss asks, Sam, do you have any specific practices that help you naturally go to PARC? Gratitude and contemplative practices are helpful in that regard.
I have both of those practices. I meditate every morning. I practice breathing. And my friend I mentioned, whose expertise is gratitude, actually studies it and talks about it. He talks about a gratitude practice, and sometimes people have gratitude groups where they start each morning and they'll send something to everybody that they're grateful for. It could be just that the lights turned on today. I've got a warm place to sit, whatever it is. And here's the way, his name is Joel Wong, W-O-N-G. And what Joel said one time, he said, what we've learned in studying gratitude is that what your grandmother told you is true. It's better to be grateful than not. Said your grandmother knew it for free. It took us $250,000 grant to prove it. But yes, I find those things helpful. And I find on my good days, I can go quickly back to that. But depending on whether I'm tired and whether I'm hungry, whether I'm angry, those things that factor into it, I am less likely to get there as quickly. So I think taking care of ourselves, getting enough sleep, I know that sounds really basic, but if I'm tired and hungry and sleepy, then late in the afternoon, I'm more likely to respond badly like the example I gave you. So yes, I agree with both of those things.
Okay, we have just a couple minutes left. If anybody else has a question, you can either post it in the chat or just feel free to unmute yourself and ask. Let's see if any more questions come up in the chat, Sam. Well, let me ask you one question, which is, what's the next challenge? What's next on your agenda? What's the next step for you?
Well, I'm trying to see if some of these things that we talk about in mediation that we do every day apply more broadly in the healthcare system, within organizations, in management and in leadership. I was at USC at the Saul Price School of Business and talking to a master's of leadership class there that had a lot of law enforcement people in it. And we talked about some of these concepts and what they're doing. And one difference for them than for me at least is that they really are in life-threatening situations. Sometimes when they're feeling it's not just their justice gene, that security and survival fear is real, and the restraint it takes for people that are doing that kind of work. And they do it imperfectly like we all do. So I'm trying to see whether these things apply more broadly in a real practical way.
Great. And another question, what do you as mediator do practically to get the mediation participants to PARC during a mediation session?
I never tell them to PARC. What I try to do at the beginning, and some of you have probably read Robert Cialdini's book, The Science of Influence. He talks about the 6 principles of influence. And what I find is, and one of them is likability, one of them is social proof. I try to prepare them at the beginning for a process that can be frustrating. And I give them permission to be angry, emotional, all those things. I tell them that I will never come in and tell them what's fair or not fair, because they exclusively get to decide that. And I tell them the other thing I won't come in and do is tell you that I understand, because I think it's arrogant for me to tell somebody that I understand. Unless I've been through their circumstances, then it's not okay for me to tell them I understand. So when they talk about those things, kind of those natural things we show up doing, and I'll let people vent pretty broadly. When I first started mediating, I kind of felt like the school principal. I was so uncomfortable. I'd want to control the environment if people got too stirred up. Unless it seems unsafe, I'll let people kind of go about as far as they need to go, short of physical violence, whether it's language, tone of voice, other things. And I find if I do that, most people will talk themselves out. They feel a little bit respected that they haven't been interrupted. And because if I interrupt them, then they're going to get in that fight mode back with me. And by doing that, they usually feel a little bit heard. It's a little bit of radical listening. And I find they sometimes will do PARC on their own. They'll at least pause and take the breath. Not so different from me at the deli when I noticed my friend wasn't saying anything.
All wonderful pointers. Thank you so much. We're just about out of time. Sam Ardery, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. I see you've got your book pictured on the screen. I've got my copy right here. It was a wonderful time, and I hope that people contribute to the Hoosier Hills Food Bank. That's hhfoodbank.org, hhfoodbank.org, in your honor. Certainly, I don't know, I'll be motivated to make a contribution. I know many others will as well. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week. With that, we are complete.
Thank you, everybody.